We cannot have a situation where chemical or biological weapons are falling into the hands of the wrong people. We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
Well, now, that was President Barack Obama 1 year and 1 day ago, clearly laying out that the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government against its own people would cross a red line for his administration. Well, today there are multiple reports that the Syrian regime carried out a toxic gas attack this week, killing at least 100 people, and some reports indicate many more. And while the government is denying it used chemical weapons, earlier today the White House was asked directly what it would take for America to use military force.
So far in Syria, more than 100,000 people have been killed. That's effectively like wiping out the whole city of South Bend, Indiana. How many more people in Syria need to die before the U.S. does employ some use of force beyond the humanitarian aid that we're providing or the provisions of small arms before there is a U.S. military use of force?
Peter, what the president does is he's evaluating difficult foreign policy problems like this, is assess the national security interests of the United States of America. And that's exactly what the president has done in this circumstance. And he has assessed that the best way for us to tackle this problem is to work closely with our international allies to present a united front to the Assad regime. It has involved working with our partners to try to pressure Bashar al-Assad to respect basic human rights and to leave power. It has involved providing assistance to the Syrian Opposition Council and to the Syrian Military Council to aid them as they fight against elements of the Assad regime troops who are waging war against them. It also means providing humanitarian assistance.
Well, that answer alone explains why other countries have stopped taking America seriously. Let's not forget, back in June, the White House confirmed that Syria had, in fact, used chemical agents against its people. Joining me now with reaction, our Fox News contributor, former spokesman for the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Rick Grinnell, and from the Lawfare Project, Brooke Goldstein. Great to see both of you. Welcome. Rick, let me begin with you because about a month ago when Samantha Power, our new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was testifying in front of Congress as part of her confirmation hearing, she called U.S. and UN Security Council inaction on Syria, quote, a disgrace. Today, the Security Council held an emergency meeting, and there are some reports that our ambassador, Samantha Power, was a no-show, couldn't even bother showing up. First of all, can you tell us if that, in fact, is true? And secondly, where is her responsibility to protect?
Right, exactly. I mean, she basically won the Nobel Peace Prize, putting forward this idea that we had a responsibility to protect. Then she went inside the White House and really told us that she was going to be there to watch over all these crises around the world. The simple fact is she's been on the job for 19 days now, and she was a no-show at an Emergency Security Council meeting. Now, the problem with this, Monica, is that we've been told for years by the Obama administration that our policy is via the UN. The only thing we're doing is via the UN. If our policy is all about the UN, how can we not have our UN ambassador show up for an emergency meeting on Syria? What does the White House think is going on? Do they actually think the American people are just going to be fine with this? This is really an outrage. When President Obama decided to make that promise, literally weeks before his re-election campaign, we knew then that this was a candidate Obama promise that would fail, and we've seen multiple times he hasn't been able to keep this promise.
And on that promise, Brooke, he promised a, quote, red line. Now it looks like that red line is a pink fuzzy line, apparently. What happens when the U.S. president draws a red line, the enemy crosses it, and then there are no consequences coming from the United States? What does that mean for our credibility and our ability to influence events there?
Well, what it means is exactly what you said. We set a precedent that you can use chemical weapons against innocent people, and the West will do nothing about it whatsoever. And this is extremely important to note. It doesn't matter who is using the chemical weapons in Syria, whether it's the Assad government, whether it's the rebels, or it's the other players that Obama mentioned, for example.
And by the way, Brooke, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it is is possible that the rebels, which are a collection of al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamists, are in fact using these chemical agents and blaming the Assad government. Isn't that a possibility?
Absolutely, and these rebels are also now fighting with Muslim Brotherhood, they're fighting with al-Qaeda, and they have a direct passage to Iraq where U.S. and coalition forces are fighting. And if we set this red line and we don't keep it, we're saying to them, go ahead, use chemical weapons. You can do so with impunity.
Here's the difficulty with this situation, which is so complex, Rick. We talk about the Syrian quote-unquote rebels. As we mentioned, it's an eclectic group of al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamists that are fighting the Assad regime. The Assad regime is no walk in the park. Assad is a brutal, brutal dictator. He's been shown to be absolutely ruthless. But if he falls, we could either get total chaos, or we could get an Islamist regime, or a combination of both, a la Egypt, in which case we have a situation that's far worse for U.S. interests and the interests of our ally, Israel.
Well, you and I both know that Assad is really a brutal dictator, but some in this administration think he's a reformer. Some of those people are actually Secretary of State at this point. Here is the reality, Monica, is that Syria is becoming Yemen. It is becoming the place where all Islamists and radicals are having a safe haven. And sadly, this is happening on the United States' watch. I mean, when we in 2006 helped push back the Syrians out of Lebanon, it was a big day. It was a time when we were telling Iran that this is no more. You are not going to be the bully of the region. But since then, since Obama has been president, we've had an NSC that really has looked the other way as all of this is happening. If you look now at Jordan and the problems that they're having, Lebanon, even Turkey, obviously Israel, we've got a region in chaos, and all of the crazies are going into Syria with a safe haven.
And here's the thing, Brooke. Bernard Lewis, the great Middle East historian, once said after 9/11, the question isn't why do they hate us? The question is, why do they not fear us? Under President Obama, these radical Islamists do not fear us. They no longer do. And secondly, after the Arab Spring, they have learned to no longer fear the local tyrants, Mubarak, Assad, Gaddafi. And so now what you have is exactly what Rick pointed out, which is a region that is imploding and a total collapse of our credibility.
Right, and it's interesting that you mentioned 9/11 because we all know that Osama bin Laden went on and called for 9/11, saying, look, we bombed the USS Cole. Look what happened to the American embassies in Africa. We did nothing, and that encouraged terrorists to attack us on 9/11. We have a policy not only of turning the other way when it comes to the slaughtering of Christians, when it comes to the use of chemical weapons. We have a policy of coddling the Muslim Brotherhood. We have Muslim Brotherhood, and you and I have talked about them before, in the government. And I can name it right here. I can name Arif Ali Khan, who is our Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Policy Development, who is a Muslim Brotherhood agent within our government, who is advising our foreign policy. This is a question that all Americans deserve an answer to.
And I think you've touched on a very important point, which is that our president is sympathetic to their cause, at the very least. Brooke, Rick, great to see you guys. Thank you so much.